Hi, this is K.A. Tucker, and this is the story behind my stories.
You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
K.A. Tucker.
I'd like to thank a few sponsors before we get into today's show, because it's those sponsors that allow us to keep bringing you shows day after day. The Son of Earp series by Chuck Buda, Shifters, Ghosts, and Demons, all set within the backdrop of the Old West. James Johnson, illegitimate son of the legendary Wyatt Earp, dreams of adventure and following in his daddy's footsteps. His mentally disabled friend Carson stands by his side. Together the friends wage war against evil. The Son of Earp series has it all. Supernatural forces are at work and the body count is rising. Can James and Carson save their cursed friend? Will they defeat the haunted gunslinger before more innocents die? Can James and Carson defeat the possessed before the demon hits the Chisholm Trail? Or will the devil win the West? Curse of the Ancients, Haunted Gunslinger, Summoner of Souls. The Son of Earp series is available in paperback, ebook, and audio formats exclusively from Amazon or free through Amazon Kindle Unlimited. Pick it up from Chuck Buda. Today there's a link in the show notes. Mad Jones, Heretic by Quinn Hillier. Mad Jones Heretic delivers sharp satire on modern religion, politics, and media, all at the same time, along with insightful representations of the vagaries of today's celebrity culture and the lunacy of internet comment threads. Controversies surrounding race and sexual morality enter in as well. Additionally, its setting at the end of the 20th century in the midst of the Y2K computer scare provides the perfect vehicle to dissect millennialist themes as well. Mad Jones Heretic by Quinn Hillier. Thank you for listening. As always, stay tuned at the end of the show for an audiobook clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series. Now on to our interview. Essence, Book 1, Septima, the first volume in the exciting new science fiction series by Nick Breaker. Troy is no longer himself. Kidnapped by aliens infected with the essence of the dead General Tomas, Troy grasps at his only hope of survival. He merges his soul with the alien parasite trying to possess him, leaving him forever changed, and not entirely for the worse. Once plagued by crippling phobias, Troy is now fearless, willing to fight his enemies with his bare hands. But with his new strength also comes a new weakness: women. Tomas was notorious for his insatiable desires, and Troy finds himself constantly resisting temptation, especially the gorgeous, manipulative Alta. Although Alta has convinced the Pyrrhans she's helping them prepare to battle the murderous Reptarans, she's actually meticulously planning to steal their ultimate power source and then abandon them to their fate. Alta won't hesitate to kill anyone in her way, and her deep love for Tomas is Troy's only advantage. He convinces Alta that Tomas has taken full control of his being and thus keeps her trust and his life. While Alta schemes, Troy covertly struggles to save the Pyrrhans and prevent the Reptarans from invading Earth. But first he must wrest back control of his own soul. Essence, Book 1, Septima, the first volume in the exciting new science fiction series by Nick Breaker. Find it on Amazon today. There's a link in the show notes. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Kathleen Tucker on the show with me. She publishes under K.A. Tucker, and she has a brand new book called Keep Her Safe that is releasing as of the recording of this in about a week. But when you hear this, it should be available or almost available. But the book is called Keep Her Safe. It's amazing. I was just telling Kathleen that we've kind of passed it around our house, and it's really cool. So we're going to get all into it. But welcome to the show, Kathleen.
Hi, thanks for having me.
I'm so excited to have you. Before we get started, we always begin the show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or a storyteller?
That's a good question. And I would say it was when I was 6 years old, and they had this program in our school library where you could create books, and the librarian would had a little machine in the back room, and a kind of a laminating binding type machine, and she had a collection of old wallpaper, the kind that you kind of passed off in remnants and you might have seen in your grandmother's bathroom, and so she would bind these pages together and make a cardboard wallpaper cover, and then you could go and you could create your story, and you gave you a box of crayons, you could write, and I loved this, and I know I did several books. I think I was I was 6 when I started, and then 7, and of course they were all princesses, they were fantasy stories. They're pretty basic 6-year-old stories, but that was just a passion of mine back then. So that's just something that always sits in my head is, wow, I was 6 years old and I actually knew what I wanted to do back then. And somehow I feel like I've lost, or I did lose that along the way in my path. And it's pretty interesting that I came back to it so many years later.
Well, that's so cool. I've heard a lot of people lately, actually, that have a similar story, that they had a teacher or a librarian or sometimes a mother who sat down with them and helped them to create a book. Because a lot of authors I've talked to have this story that when they were young, they loved books, but they were kind of magical, like books just came from somewhere. And we didn't really believe that people wrote books. They're just kind of these magical things that appeared, But when you have a teacher or a mother or a librarian who actually helps you create a book, it really kind of takes the etherealness away and tells the kid, this is something you can do. And I think that really goes a long way to building confidence in writers in a weird kind of way.
Oh, it's absolutely true. And the funny thing is, it's one of those things that, yeah, as a kid, you don't really think about it. You don't. In my mind, I wasn't sitting there thinking I'm going to go write books or who wrote these books. It's just these are fantastic stories. And I grew up. My mom, she's always been a reader, and we have a library, and as long as I know, our living room at our house has these wall-to-wall, or has had these wall-to-wall shelves with books, and there are all kinds of books, and there are leather books, and there are gardening books, and there's all kinds of books. And it's just I've always grown up around books. There's never been a time where there haven't been books in my house, and so, but I don't. It was kind of one of those background things. I think it's just one of those standards. You get up, you go to school, you read, you go to bed, you eat, you do, the basics, but books was always there.
What sorts of books did you love to read when you were young and, going through like high school? Did your taste change, and were there certain genres that really you gravitated toward?
Yeah, you know what? When I was little, obviously it was very much princesses. I loved the Babysitter's Club. That was a staple. I read every single one of those. I wanted to be the little girl who was starting a business and babysitting. And then I was very much also into choose your own adventure books, which is actually, I haven't seen those in a long time out in the market. So I'm not sure if they're really popular anymore, but I was all about the choose your own adventures probably when I was about 8 or 9. And what the funny thing is, I went through a stretch of not, I don't want to say not reading, but not reading as avidly when I was, probably about 13, 14, 15. And that's a scary thing when I think back to it now, because I think that's a problem in a lot of today's world, and a lot of families, a lot of households where, you lose kids around that age of reading when they hit that adolescent stage. But then I got back into it, and it was very much, Jane Eyre and I obviously Anne of Green Gables. I obviously have to mention that. That was probably one of my, I'm Canadian, so of course I read Anne of Green Gables and Lucy Maud Montgomery, and I read Emily of New Moon, and I was addicted to those books as well. Very much getting into kind of the more the classics for a stage there, and then got into university, and it was all about textbooks. And again, I think that's a time when a lot of people lose their passion for reading, and I think that happened to me as well. And then my husband, with funny enough, when I was in my 20s, and he wasn't my husband then, but he got me hooked on high fantasy, and I hadn't read it ever. That high fantasy, um, well, George R. R. Martin is a little bit less high fantasy, but
Kind of
the Wheel of
kings and
Time,
magic and
yeah, the Wheel of Time. Robert
oh yeah.
Jordan. He said, you've got to read this, and you've got to read this, you've got to read this. Just get through the first 100 pages, because the first 100 pages is kind of that really heavy high fantasy introduction. But I refused for the longest time, because I had a boyfriend in high school who played Dungeons and Dragons, and I just for some reason associated playing Dungeons and Dragons with reading high fantasy. And I mean, so I just refused for some reason, because I wasn't into Dungeons and Dragons. But I finally picked up Robert Jordan, and I devoured. And then I went through probably about 7 years of reading every high fantasy series I could get my hands on. So it's just kind of funny. I've gone through phases, and then obviously I went into kind of a dystopian phase, and then I went into a romance phase. And I mean, that's probably around the time that I started writing in my it was early 30s when I actually sat down and started writing again.
And that is, it's so funny, Kathleen. I'm sitting here shaking my head as you're talking, because that has been a similar story for so many people. We all go through this fantasy stage. It's so strange. Authors that write military thrillers and romance and all this kind of stuff that like everybody went through a Robert Jordan phase. It's so weird, but it's like this common thread with all of us, that we all love to kind of get immersed in a fantasy world, and then when we start writing our own stuff, it's like we're writing fantasy worlds of our own. They just take on a different shape, but there's something about that type of storytelling that maybe kind of awakens something in us. I haven't really put my finger on it, but it's so interesting that there's that common thread through so many people.
Well, I think you're right. Absolutely. I think reading or stepping into a high fantasy world, it forces you to step out of your world. It's so far obviously out of your world, because there's dragons and there's wizards and there's everything that you don't have in your everyday life. And it's almost like an extreme step. Like, I'm going to see how far I can expand, or my mind can expand. And then you rein back in, but it sets a bar of, how far can my imagination go? And when you read fantasy, it really obviously, it stretches your imagination. Good fantasy anyway stretches your imagination to what seems like impossible levels or feats. And when you're a writer, you really do have to do that. I get caught up so many times in the difference between fantasy or a make-believe world and what's realistic. And obviously there's a fine dance there, especially when you're trying to write not fantasy, but you're writing suspense, and you're writing a romance, and you're writing just regular fiction. Yeah, it's tough.
That's so interesting. So you said that you had no plans to be a writer. What did you pursue career-wise?
I actually was. I was in business, and I was in corporate sales and sales strategy, marketing type roles. I had a pretty healthy career working at Procter and Gamble and then Coca-Cola. I took a business degree in university in Toronto. To be honest, I did not take any creative writing courses whatsoever. It was all, and it's very ironic. It was very business. It was economics. It was math.
Thank you, Babysitters Club.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Another thing, I should have seen that. The writing was on the wall there. And yeah, so I was just very business, very practical. I mean, because the thing is, while I did grow up with books, and my mother was a teacher, and she loved literature and such, she was also, I grew up in an environment where, if I were to come home when I was 15 or 16 and say, I'm going to write books, they'd say, okay, well, can you pay your mortgage with that? Can you, are you going to have a career with that? Are you going to have a pension with that? All of those very practical, that practical mentality. And so that's also the environment that I grew up in. So, and I mean, any writer out there knows writing is tough. It's a tough career. It's a tough career to do well and to be able to survive off of. And so, there was always that balance of the practicalness, and I am a practical person. So.
Well, it's a really interesting discussion to have about should a writer eschew studying writing and pursuing a creative degree, or should the writer pursue other interests and other careers so that they can get worldly experience that then the writer uses to translate into story. And just as soon as you have decided one is better than the other, then you meet someone who has the exact opposite story. Like you say, well, if you go all the way through college and you say, I'm going to be a writer and that's the only thing I've ever wanted to do, and I'm going to get an MFA and I'm going to write the great 21st century novel, and then you see them not do that, and just kind of, get stuck into navel gazing and all that. And you say, well, you should have gone out and got a career and then, would have equipped yourself to really report on the world. Well, as soon as you decide that, then there's a 20-year-old, who, steps out of college and writes this amazing novel, so it's a really difficult thing, but I do think that, that sometimes getting out and just experiencing the world is maybe some of the best education.
Oh, absolutely. I feel like there's really no right answer. Everyone has their own path, and every writer who I've met has feels like a different path, even though there's a lot of similarities. And I think maybe, I don't know. I wish, stepping back now, I wish I took more writing courses as I was growing up. I wish that had been kind of, in the back of my mind is, okay, this might be an opportunity. But at the same time, I don't think that I would be the writer that I am now if I hadn't gone into this world where, in the business world, you're dealing with all kinds of people in a non-writing. I was never analyzing them, or not. I mean, as a writer, how you obviously understand this. You sit down, and with every conversation you have, or with every coffee shop you go into, and any exchange, you're in the back of your mind, you're kind of cataloging what's being said, and the how they're saying it, and that would be, I don't know how many times I've sat there thinking, this would be perfect for a book, or that's how a character could answer that, and I wasn't thinking like that in that world. But the funny thing is I retained so much of it without that thought. And things are coming up to me now from 10 years ago. I was writing a line in a book just now, or I was creating a character, and I'm like, I remember her. She was, in my work environment, and this is perfect, and she would be perfect for this book. And I don't know if it's a hard or a hard question to answer. I don't know what I would be like if I had taken a different path to get here.
Right. So your husband gets you into the Wheel of Time, and
yes.
you take this great journey through, modern literature and really reawaken your passion for reading. What was the catalyst that turned you from reader to writer?
So I was on maternity leave with my second daughter, and in Canada we have a year maternity leave for each baby. Actually, now it's 18 months, but back then it was a year.
That's amazing.
I know, it's fantastic.
In the U.S., you're lucky to get 6 weeks.
Which I honestly don't understand how anyone. I feel for you guys. But so a year, in one sense, it sounds fantastic. In another sense, for a person like me, who was always on the go and had things going on, and was using my brain a lot, obviously at work, it can also be quite daunting. And then you add in the fact that I'm in Canada and it's cold here for how many months of the year. And I'm not exaggerating in that. You just don't want to go out if you're like me. I hibernate. And I had a first child who was, she was difficult in the sense that right now we know that she's on the spectrum, but back then we didn't know. And so I had this, 20-something month old kid with some significant delays. And then I had a newborn who screamed at the top of her lungs all the time. And I needed an escape. That's really what it was. And I just had an idea. And so my youngest was, she was 3 months old when I sat down. I said, you know what, I've got an idea and I wanted to start to write. So that's really what it was. It was an escape for me to not just dive into other people's worlds, but to create my own. And it was that opportunity where I didn't have to leave the house because I couldn't, but I had an opportunity to step out and just kind of be somewhere else for a little bit. And so I started writing, and that just spiraled into this to this crazy passion, and eventually a career, which I really never expected. I never put that pressure on myself, which I think again is a great way to approach writing and the whole publishing career, or the whole publishing industry. But
yeah, so what was the first story that you wrote that you got published?
Well, so I self-published my first one, and that was called Anathema, and it was kind of this dystopian, paranormal fantasy mishmash young adult series that it turned into a series. And that was, I just started writing, and I mean, I really didn't have any clue what I was doing. Then I finished the first draft, but at that point I thought, I love this. I'm going somewhere, but I really need to learn what I'm doing before I actually even think of hands off to anyone else. And so I spent many months doing online revision courses and just to really educate myself, because again, I wasn't leaving my house at this point. And I very slowly, I think it was about 17 or 18 months after I started this whole process, I thought, you know what, I'm ready. And I did a little bit of research just about, we did the whole publishing industry and the whole querying process and the agents and stuff. And I threw out a couple of query letters, got rejected. But at that same point in time, self-publishing was really starting to take. And I sat down and I thought, I can do this because I have the whole business background to it. And because this is a hobby, I have a whole other career. I don't, I want somebody to read this book. No one reads this book, or if 5 people read this book, or if, more than that, fantastic. But I cannot just stick this in a box. And so I self-published it. And obviously educated myself on the whole the editing and the getting an editor and getting a cover artist and all of that. And I put it out there, and then I went back to work, but I continued writing on the side in the evenings, late night evenings. And I think I self-published a couple more, and then that's when I wrote 10 Tiny Breaths, and that was the one that I switched into contemporary for that one, and I self-published that again, but it took off. I feel like I hit that magic time in the market when it wasn't flooded, and people grabbed it. And I had built a little bit of a base already from my other self-published books, so I had readers waiting for it, and that was another kind of just a magical luck thing happening. And then within I think it was about a month after that, I had a publishing deal and an agent, and everything it was pretty crazy.
Wow. It looks like you published that first book around 2011. Is that right?
Yes.
So
yes.
That would have been just as the Kindle revolution wave was cresting and really becoming white hot, wasn't it?
Yep.
What an awesome time to get in. I can only imagine, because I was not publishing then, but I was beginning to read all of the stories, and what an awesome time. So you wrote this dystopian series and then switched to contemporary. Did you self-publish the first contemporary books, and how did you switch to your traditional publisher that you have now?
So 10 Tiny Breaths was my first one as a contemporary romance, and I just hit that magical sweet spot. I really feel like I lucked out. I feel like if I had self-published 6 months later, I might have had a different career. Maybe even 6 months before I would have had a career. Who knows? But I self-published that, and then to make a fairly long story short, I started getting interest from publishers, and then I had an agent contact me, and she contacted me actually through a recommendation of somebody else who had read my book and loved it and said, you know what, and she's a Canadian agent, so I think that might have been part of the connection. They said, you know what, here's a writer, we love her book, or I loved her book, and I think you would love it, and I think you should represent her. And so she contacted me, and I still remember it was January 2nd, so it was the day of 2013. It was the day that the publishing houses opened right after New Year's, after, how they shut down between Christmas and New Year's. And an editor from Atria Books, which is an imprint at Simon & Schuster, she had read my book just as pleasure reading, kind of, searching out this, as you said, it was the indie market or the Amazon, the Kindle market was red hot. So this editor was really, I think, kind of searching for the, next best popular author or next big thing or, an opportunity basically. And so I just lucked out. She picked up 10 Tiny Breaths and she started reading it, loved it. And so she sent me an email on January 2nd saying, I've read your book and I really loved it. And you have an agent. And it was literally, I was signing the papers with my agent at that point. So that same day, I think. So, it just went from there of a lot of back and forth. And I signed a 4-book deal with them. We went with Atria, for 10 Tiny Breaths and 3 more in that series. So they wanted to make that into a series because that was one of the things that a lot of readers said is that they want to know about the other characters. So they're all standalones and they were individual books, which I actually prefer writing, but within the same world.
Nice. So what was the story behind 10 Tiny Breaths?
So 10 Tiny Breaths is a story about 2 sisters who lose their parents to drunk driving, and they move to Miami basically to escape the backup situation, the situation they're living in with their aunt and uncle, which is not ideal. And the one girl, Casey, was in the car accident, and so she lived through that. And obviously was extremely traumatized. And so it's just basically a story about these 2 sisters making their way in this, ending up in this apartment with misfits. It kind of feels like it, but it turns into, a strange family connection, and they build a new family. And at the same time, she meets a guy, because it's a romance, obviously. So Casey meets a kind of a mysterious guy who shows up and seems to be wanting to, break through her walls. She's a tough cookie after that accident. And I obviously don't want to say too much more about it without spoiling it, but that's the gist of it.
I love that it was set in Miami. Was that a reaction to a snowed-in winter in Canada?
You know what? Kind of, sort of. It's funny because people always ask me why I choose the locations that I do, and why Casey and Livy were from Grand Rapids, Michigan, and then why they end up in Miami. And I'm like, well, I kind of felt like those are polar opposites of the cold, and nice and hot.
Well, that's and that's a really interesting thought to kind of run with. I'm always interested to see how place affects people's writing, like where you're from and how that seeps into the stories that you tell. Some people, if you're from a city that kind of has its own character and feel, like the city kind of becomes part of one of the cast of characters, in some weird way. It's weird that when you have if you begin a story in a cold place like Grand Rapids and then wind up in Miami, not only do you get, to move the characters, but the place, can actually become part of the story. The switch from cold to hot, and the separation between those two can really influence the story. And like you said, polar opposites there, and not only just weather, but I would think that you can really use those extremes as part of the storytelling.
Oh, absolutely. It's funny because as I said, I was Canadian. I'm from Toronto or just outside of Toronto, and I have yet to set a book in Canada. And I'm working on one now, but I always end up setting books in cities that are not my own. And typically they are in the US, except for I had one book that was set in Dublin because I had been there and visited and I wanted to write a book there. But settings, I spend quite a bit of time trying to figure out the perfect setting. I know a lot of writers they choose that fictional place, and I sometimes do that, but I always model it after a real place. Because I need to be able to ground my story in a place. And then once I ground that story, I do as much research as I can. And for one particular, that's why I really started to feel how setting can make a story evolve into what it is. And that was with Bearing Water. And I said that in Oregon. and in a small town in the mountains, which I've never been to. But I did a ton of research and I found somebody who, another author. So thank God I could ask all these questions of her and she'd understand where I was coming from, saying, okay, well, I need to know this and I need a location that has this. And I had this place in my mind already. And so she found it for me, which was great, actually through her father. And as I started to research and I use Pinterest a lot and I use Google Maps a lot to try and to place things as accurately as I can. And it really does become a character, really, as much as the characters themselves. And if it doesn't, then I feel like there's something lacking there.
So how do you go about researching these places that obviously you can't travel, every time that you're going to start a book, or do you? Or is Google the great research tool?
Well, you know what? I mean, the best way to do it is to be there, obviously, or to write about places, that to me that's the ideal. When I went to Dublin and I just wandered through and I saw all these places and I walked through the park, and it just made it that much easier to be able to describe it in a way that Google can't, and in a way that, third-hand knowledge can't. But obviously a lot of writers can't do that and they can't travel around to every location. And so we're lucky in today's world. And I always say this, I don't know how writers wrote books 20 years ago when they didn't have the internet. I commend them. To me, it's incredible that they could write in the way that they do. That being said, you try and take advantage of as many of the tools as you have. And so I'll use Google Earth. I'll use Pinterest. I'll spend hours on Pinterest just searching through people who live in the area and what kinds of pictures they take. And, not specifically photographers and fancy pictures as much as, they could be the everyday person. Instagram is another fantastic platform or tool, not just for marketing and social media marketing type stuff, but also for research, I find.
Yeah. There's so many, and Instagram is a great place to kind of get the flavor of a place, and see where what people are experiencing there. That's a great tool.
Absolutely. I mean, I could say Portland and Denver and Seattle. Those are in Austin. So those are pretty much, four of my favorite cities in the United States. And they're all quirky in their own way. And you will never be able to get that until you actually go to each one of those cities physically. And no Google map is going to tell me that. And even Instagram's not going to tell me that. So there's a balance. I mean, to me, my first choice is always, if you can get there, because you will just make that setting that much more impactful.
Right. Well, you mentioned Austin, and that's where the new book, Keep Her Safe, is set. You've actually written like 16 books now, I think, right?
Yes.
Yeah. How did we get to Keep Her Safe? Like, what is the story that this book comes from?
So I have a strange fascination with corruption in organizations. And lies and that kind of that world. For some reason, I always end up when I'm sitting there and reading news articles, and that's where I get a lot of inspiration from, is those really strange articles that pop up in your Facebook news feed, the ones that it's kind of the clickbait ones with the ridiculous, like, woman chops off head and sticks it in freezer. Well, I'm the one that clicks on those.
Right. And you'll never guess what happens next.
Yes. And I'm like, click, I have to know.
I want to know.
Yeah. I spend so much time reading those, and it's not so much because, I believe them, but I find crazy things like that really do inspire. And so kind of you add all of that up. And then I was reading, I love Austin, by the way, and I knew I wanted to set a book in Texas, and specifically in Austin, because it has its own flavor from anywhere else in Texas that I've been. That being said, obviously the book has a much darker vein, and it's not really a feeling that I get from being when I've been in Austin, because I, haven't dealt with police corruption and things like that there. But I started reading articles, and there was Keep Her Safe is kind of a mishmash of all kinds of articles that I've read from other parts, not Austin and not the Austin Police Department, but other places that, there have been legitimate problems, real problems, like in cases where, a task force of cops have done things that have been illegal tied to drug worlds, and, or where there have been police chiefs who've been caught, making deals with people, and just all kinds of crazy things. And so I pluck those little ideas from here and there and everywhere, and I tend to build stories. I spin them in my own way. And so that's really where Keep Her Safe came from, was just a collection of those really strange stories. And then on top of that, I went through this stage. I'm a Netflix junkie and binge watcher. So
most of the audience is shaking their head. Yes.
Yeah. Like, I mean, it's one of those things that I think people fought admitting for a long time. And I'm like, you just need to admit that you do it and just move on.
Right.
We all do it. And so I started watching Scandal on Netflix, and I watched 78 episodes, I think it was, between Christmas and New Year's. I said to my husband, this is inspiration for me. I need to watch this. And so he just kind of took over with the kids. And I just sat there and I watched like 10 to 12 episodes a day. Is
she going to start giving me side eye thinking,
Yeah. Yeah.
Imagining everything wrong in the world is happening. Yeah.
So, I watched, I watched that. And it's not something per se that I got from there, but it was that feel of how everyone, there's so much, when you get into organizations, there's corruption, but at the root of all of that corruption is typically a lot of very personal motives. It's not this big grand motive. It could be a very personal motive, and it could be a very, personal secret that someone's trying to hide. And that just spirals. And then you add all of those things up and you end up with this crazy story. And that's also where Keep Her Safe, that's how I built Keep Her Safe. So, I kind of get inspiration from everywhere.
On one of the back cover blurbs of the copy of the book I have says, "Making a murderer meets scandal," and that's definitely that oozes through this book, because I've watched a little bit of Scandal. I haven't watched a ton of it, but I got obsessed with Making a Murderer. That show. And because every episode, there's a twist, and there's this real life story where I know that he's guilty, and then the next episode, oh my God, he is totally framed, and you go back and forth there. How did because you're telling a story of police corruption, and obviously you haven't worked in law enforcement, and this was not your career. How do you prepare yourself? One, to tell that kind of story. How do you prepare yourself to know the inner workings, and then how do you prepare yourself to tell a story that doesn't paint all law enforcement as corrupt? And you know what I'm saying? How do you balance that out so that you get a great story with plenty of tension without just whitewashing the entire thing?
Oh yeah, that was a tough one and a worry for me, and it's still a worry. With it hasn't come out yet, so people haven't read it yet. I don't have the en masse opinion, but I was very careful in trying to not, because that is obviously a major social problem right now, and political issue is one bad thing goes wrong in a police force and all of a sudden all police officers are terrible, right? So and I didn't want that, but at the same time, what makes the story is the bad apples, those few bad apples. That's what you're typically going to write a book about. So I have actually a couple friends who are police officers, and so that has definitely helped me a ton, not even just in Keep Her Safe, but in other books that I've written. So I'm able to bounce a lot of ideas off of them, or questions, and just thoughts on, okay, if this were to happen, then what's likely, and what would the typical procedure be for something like this? So that's been going on for years at this point in other books. And so by the time I sat down to Keep Her Safe, I was able to sit down and say, okay, I feel like I have a good enough understanding, but at the same time, I was trying to avoid writing a police procedural, right? There's books out there that are, I read them and I'm like, man, a lot about the police force and police procedure. And I was not doing that, or I was trying not to do that. So it was kind of this dance of giving people enough that it felt real, but also not getting so specific that I could get too much wrong, if that makes sense. And also because all different areas or different or regions in different countries have different policies, and they have different practices and procedures. So I would spend a lot of time reading a lot of articles, news articles from Texas specifically, and trying to understand maybe a little bit more there, because their structure is different from, say, the Toronto Police Force, where I could easily get answers as to, okay, what's ranking and how long do you have to be there and what's the process for hiring and getting promoted. Very simple questions like that you don't really think of until you sit down and try and write the book. So there's kind of that aspect, in the sense that I've been lucky in that I've had people to tap into. And then in terms of that fine balance, I tried, and I think and I'm trying not to give too much away about the story as I say this, but for me, the way that the whole story with Abe came out, and how he was a good man, obviously that's said at the very beginning. I try to make that as much of a focus as all of the bad things that were happening, if that makes sense. It honestly, it was a hard dance. And then there was little bits, and you try and add little bits in the story where there's police officers who are actually doing the right thing, and, in conversations where they're actually helpful. And it was tough. It was tough.
So tell us about the characters in this book, and what kind of trouble do you get them up to?
Well, so there's Noah, and there is Gracie or Grace. Those are the two main characters, and they've grown up in very different worlds when you actually meet them. And Noah is the son of a police officer, and, well, she's now a police chief of the Austin Police Department, and that's Jackie Marshall. And at the very beginning of the story, she kills herself, but not before admitting, basically in kind of a drunken stupor, that all things might not be as they seemed in a long past death of her police partner and a very close friend and mentor of Noah's, and that was Abe. And so he is left with kind of this conscience of, and that his mother has killed herself. She was drunk. Do I say anything? Do I do anything? Do I just kind of write this off as it was just obviously the ramblings of a mentally unstable woman who killed herself, and she felt some sort of guilt? Or do I look into this a little bit more? Do I be myself about this? And then there was a few things that she leaves him that obviously then kind of set him on this path to reconnect with Gracie, who's living in Arizona. And she's the daughter of Abe, who is the police officer who was basically framed, or Jackie suggests was framed for corruption, police corruption. And so Gracie is living in a very different world from Noah, who's, obviously a privileged white boy in Texas, or man in Texas. And she is living in a trailer park with her mother, who is a drug addict and basically ready to one foot in the grave. And Gracie's just trying to keep things together for her life. And so when Noah's showing up here with some questions that she doesn't have answers to, she's obviously a little bit curious, definitely very suspicious. And the two of them, for very different reasons, start digging and investigating. And that was a tough part for me too, because I have a hard time with characters who have absolutely no business investigating crime and corruption and murders, who start then going and investigating crime and corruption murders. It's very difficult for me to kind of frame my head around that when I'm reading a book. So I was trying to position this in a way where, it's very clear that these two really don't know what they're doing, but they have a little bit of background. Noah obviously has a bit of education working in the district attorney office, but they get a lot of help. And so they kind of bumble their way through.
And then it kind of goes off the rails for the characters.
Yeah, very off the rails, right? Because they're just these two 20-something-year-old kids who are, going by a lot of emotion more than anything. Noah needs in his head to clear his his conscience of his mother's name in his head. And Gracie really wants to know, and she needs to clear her dad's name for her, as well as her mother, as well as for her dad's memory of her dad.
Right, which gives the characters really interesting motivation to go through a story like this. That they're not just the Scooby-Doo kids, who are riding around in a van with no adult supervision.
Absolutely.
Solving
right?
mysteries. You really give believable motivation to these young people, and the story really kind of ramps up and takes off in a really interesting way. Was it important to you to tell their story emotionally while keeping this kind of the story that feels like it could have been taken from any number of headlines around any number of countries now, but you keep the story very I'm searching for the word I want to use here, but you keep it very personal to them, while really dealing with some heavy subjects. Was it important to you to really keep a focus on how these individual people deal with this as this big story unfolds?
Absolutely. And that stems to the whole idea. I mean, I'm known from my readers, I've written mainly romance. And even when I wrote He Will Be My Ruin, which is more of a kind of a sexy thriller, there's still an element of potential romance there for a while. And so my readers are looking for that with every book I write. And so for me, I mean, if you're going to have any sort of romance in there, you also have to have that emotional background. You have to have that personal level. Otherwise, it's just straight up suspense. And not to say that suspense books don't also delve into that, but maybe not quite to the same personal level and detail as say a romantic suspense, or in any case as Keep Her Safe did, and what I was trying to do. So yeah, it was very important to me to have that connection between the two main characters and show the conflict and show the stages as they go through them, from being shocked to being angry to being motivated for different reasons to some sort of bittersweet conclusion.
Kathleen, do you get feedback from readers that maybe aren't the typical readers that you would think would pick up these books? And what I'm saying is, like, you talked about earlier, getting into high fantasy and then, switching genres, and then, kind of mysteries, and then, romance, and then kind of this hodgepodge of different genres that all really kind of coalesce into making you who you are. I think a lot of times, especially men, when they see a book and it maybe has a romance element, they're like, that's not for me, and go on. And then when you really dig into, especially your books, you start realizing that, it's not just, and I hate to even frame it that way, it's not just a romance book. There's so much more going on. There's mystery, there's suspense, there's an excellent story, there's a police procedural. And the funny thing is, in our lives, we don't want to just have suspense. We want to have a healthy romantic relationship with our spouse and with the people that we love, and we like for exciting things to happen. And we're not two-dimensional people. So why should we expect our books to be two-dimensional or one-dimensional? You know what I'm saying? So do you get feedback from men who have maybe stumbled onto your book and have been like, I'm so glad I did?
Oh, absolutely. And it's funny you say that, because it's so true. And especially because I am so immersed in the romance genre, and so many of my readers are typically female. And I mean, I will admit, I would call my books kind of more female centric in general, because there is always that romance kind of worked into there, or seeped into there. And I need that as a writer and as a reader. I need the romance. Even with fantasy, I was laughing I watched, and this is, tying to a movie as opposed to a book, but I watched The Hobbit, and I love Lord of the Rings. I love them, obsessed with them. And I watched the first Hobbit, and I'm like, no, this doesn't do it for me. And it took me a while to figure out that there was no love story in the first one.
Right.
And I'm like, I don't care if they're orcs. Like, I need something. I need some sort of romance or some sort of hope there.
Some sort of humanity.
Yes, exactly. And so, I mean, if with every book that I write, I've sat there and toyed with the idea of, can I just maybe I should just write a straight up suspense with absolutely no female, male, or, it could be male, could be female, but some sort of romantic theme there or tie. And I don't think I can do it. That being said, I have had readers who I've not expected reach out to me, and I always love it. I had a man actually reach out to me who read 10 Tiny Breaths, and that's romance. It's got a heavy theme to it, and there's definitely more to it. There's family and friendship, but there's heavy romance in there. And he was actually a survivor of the 9/11 attack, and he was in one of the towers. And so from his perspective, he looked at it as very therapeutic because he was suffering from PTSD. And Casey is suffering from PTSD, really. And the funny thing is, it was always there, and I described it, but I never really labeled it as that, and I never thought of it as that. And so he found a connection to that character in a way that I had not really intentionally meant, which was, it's to this day, I mean, I still remember that. And I've had other people connect with me, but it's true. I honestly, I wish more men would pick up my books. I am also nervous of more men picking up my books because I don't know. I don't know what if it would be what they would want it to be. Keep Her Safe, I feel like, if anything, that might be the one that might sway some men, but yeah.
It's 2018, Kathleen.
I know. You should read my books like men read my books. But it's true. There is that stigma, and I see it every day. I've had people say, "Oh, so you read romance?" And I've had men say that, and I can just, there's that unspoken thing there in their voice and in their demeanor that I'm like, they've already written me off. So
right. Well, the next time you're in a restaurant or somewhere and you see someone proposing to their wife, just walk over and say, you know what? If you don't read romance, you can't do that. Get up and quit making a show of it.
No, absolutely. This is my thing. But all men, I feel like sometimes they forget that. And when I worked in the corporate world, I was writing, and I remember that, where people are like, "Oh, what do you write?" Oh, at the time I was writing fantasy, but I had also written a romance, and automatically they just, oh, okay. You mean you're not reading, or you're not doing nonfiction? You're not writing some the next big, great literary thing? And I'm like, you know what? I'm writing what I want to write, but it's true.
Yeah. Well, the new book is called Keep Her Safe. I highly recommend it to men and women. I'll just put it out there. It's an excellent book. It's an excellent story. And that's what matters, is it's an excellent story. Kathleen, if people are not familiar with you and your work, where can they find you to follow along and to kind of get plugged into everything that you do?
So I would say my website is www.katuckerbooks.com, but you can also find me on social media. I'm on Instagram. That's my favorite place, but I'm also on Facebook a lot. But yeah, I'm all over. I'm definitely connected through social media and through my website, so you can get all your information there.
Excellent. We're going to send everybody to pick up a copy of it. It carries the author story seal of approval. Kathleen, K.A., thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
Brian moved in closer, entering the rusty greenhouse through its eastern arch, keeping clear of the subject's line of sight. He pressed through the rose house, nothing but thorns, and into the grapery, nothing but vines. The meditation tones of the wind chimes were like fingers lipping crystal goblets. Two marble children hugged each other, swallowed by the swamp of a neglected fountain. Brian's shadow entered the palm house, the domed space at center, and the rest of him followed. Brian took aim at the figure's back and whistled. "Hands up there!" The figure waggled its shoulders a little, reaching for a weapon, maybe. "Did you hear me? Hands up! Now!" Brian circled the intruder. He took out his penlight and shone it in the man's face. Shit. Burlap and buttons. Just one of the stupid scarecrows. He thumbed his comm. "False alarm!" But Abby didn't reply. He'd lost signal. He slung his rifle back and put up his fists. He delivered a slow-motion punch to the scarecrow's head, an old potato sack with black lettering down one cheek. Its red button eyes were sewn on with plastic thread, maybe dental floss. The mouth was a bright red shoestring hot glued to the burlap. One end had shaken loose, so that the mouth drooped like a stroke victim's. Brian delivered a slow karate kick to its body, a business suit stuffed with hay. A stink rose. The guts were rotted. Only this one scarecrow had survived the storm. A couple dozen others had fallen face down in the mud of the palm house, strewn about like martyrs of some great scarecrow war. Motion caught his eye, and he frowned. A second scarecrow had survived the storm. He hadn't noticed it before, but he should have. This one wore a yellow hard hat and carried an axe. The hard hat was caked with mud, as if the scarecrow had been on the ground. Had someone righted it? Brian turned away from it, disturbed, and noticed a third scarecrow leaning against a nearby wall. This one wore a clown costume and mud-soaked rainbow hair. How the hell had he missed that one? He was an idiot. If that had been a person, they might have shot him in the head by now. He backed away from the trio of scarecrows. They reminded him of some Sunday school tableau. He was about to make his exit when a white face flew from the shadows. The hockey mask of Jason Voorhees, the machete-wielding psychopath of the Friday the 13th movies. The mask landed at Brian's feet and stared up at him. It was a dime store plastic thing, trailing a broken length of pink rubber band, with two sad hollows for eyes above an extruded nub of nose. The cheeks were pierced with little holes and bore 3 bloody streaks of war paint. Some poor scarecrow had lost its fright mask. Brian bent and picked it up, turned it in his hand, letting moonlight play across the concave interior face, creating that optical illusion where the gaze follows you. He lifted the mask, thinking of some childhood Halloween. When? Decades ago, when he'd been Jason Voorhees, stalking Sleepy Hollow, his tinfoil machete dripping Heinz 57. When did I get to be so old? People didn't appreciate the classic scares anymore, the old shock cuts and startle tricks. He made little panting horror flick sounds, ch-ch-ch, ah-ah, held the mask to his own face and looked through its cut-out eyes. "Trick or treat," he whispered. The answer was trick. A dozen scarecrows surrounded him. A dozen more writhed up from the mud. The eyeless corpse of Ferris the gate guard shrugged a hungry pecking crow and pounced.